All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nate Mitchell, and I'm one of the preceptors for this class. And Professor Show, as she said last class, she's out of town and she'll be back on Tuesday. So she left the class to me, and I guess we'll find out over the course of this class whether that was a mistake or not. But it should be a pretty fun class. We have a fun topic of the week. So I'd like to start by listening to a scene from Grease. We're actually going to be listening to a scene from the musical, not the movie, if you know it. And Grease is a musical written in the 1970s, but it takes place in the 1950s, and it actually uses a lot of musical features that we associate with the 1950s. In fact, it even says a new 50s rock and roll musical in the original playbill. So in this scene, there's a guy who is just kind of like us here in this class. He's just sort of been figuring out some basic chord progressions on his guitar. In fact, he's just learned enough chords that he can finally play a song that all of his friends know. And of course, this isn't a real song from the 50s, but it's designed to sound sort of like a top 40s hit from the 1950s. So let's listen to about half of this song. And hopefully my audio works.
Hey, dude, where did you get the guitar? Yeah, I just started taking lessons during vacation. I was just working on a G chord. I already know a C and an A minor and an F. Hey, that's terrific. Hey, let me play with the chorus, Elvis. Yeah, come on. Oh, okay. Lesson 4, Magic Changes by Ronnie Bell. C, 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 A minor, F, 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 G, 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 G7, C, 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 A minor, F, 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 G, 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 G7. What I'm playing on the radio? Why do I start swaying to and fro? I have never heard that song before, but if I don't hear it anymore, it's still familiar to me, sends a thrill right through me, because those chords remind me of the night that I first fell in love to those magic changes. My heart arranges a melody that's never the same, a melody that's calling your name and makes you please come back to me. Please come to me. Don't make them begging. The music I wanna hear is once again you whisper in my ear.
I'm not even going to tell you how long that took me to animate. But as the lyrics imply, even if you've never heard this song before, this might be something that sounds a little bit familiar to you. And let me play an actual song from the era that it's quoting, and see if you can point out any similarities between them.
When the night has come and the land is dark and the moon is the only night we'll see.
So anybody hear any similarities? Well, what if I put up the bass lines and chord progressions? Now, did you see any similarities? Of course, I'm transposing the Stand By Me. It's originally an A, but I'm transposing it to C just to make it super obvious. But yeah, so they all use the exact same 4 chords. And notice that they even use very similar bass lines, right? Here are some moments in the bass line that sound very, very similar. So I'm just going to play the 2 bass lines back to back, right? So here's the Magic Changes bass line. And the Stand By Me bass line. Yes, no wonder arpeggio changes sound so familiar to us, right? Because it's quoting some musical features from one of the most iconic doo-wop songs of all time, right? But it's actually doing more than that, because a lot of these same features are not unique to Stand By Me at all. They actually occur over and over again in countless songs throughout the 1950s. In fact, here's a Wikipedia list that just lists a whole bunch of songs that use this same chord progression, and often with this same bass line as well. So we're going to take a tour through just some of these. So as you hear them, try to listen for that bass line and those chord changes. Yeah, because this chord progression is used in so many iconic songs from the 50s and early 60s, we call it the 50s progression. And as you can see, it's represented here as a 1, 6, 4, 5 progression. And so, actually, people continue to use this progression, even in modern day pop songs, to kind of call back to the 1950s. One song that was popular relatively recently is the song Marvin Gaye by Charlie Puth, which is, of course, references the singer Marvin Gaye, who was an important singer at this time. Uses the same chord progressions, and even in the music video, there's this kind of mock-up 50s sock hop aesthetic going on. Let's just listen to a little bit of that music video.
Yeah, and now, Charlie Puth.
Let's Marvin Gaye and get it on. You get the healing that I want. Just like they say in the song. Till the dawn, let's Marvin Gaye and get it on.
So people still use this to reference 50s music, right? But at the same time, that's not all that people do with it. This is also just kind of a nice progression, and people use it to do other things as well. I definitely don't think that Green Day wants us to be thinking about Stand By Me when they use the song in this, in the chord progression in this song. All right, so the basic idea here is that even with some very basic materials that we've learned in this class, we can still make a lot of really interesting melodies and that are in a lot of different pop genres. Right, so that's what we're going to be doing today, is taking a look at what makes pop music tick. And I should say there's no way that in an hour of time that we can get through every aspect of pop music, of course. So there's going to be a lot that's going to be left unsaid here. But we can look at how basic materials that we know can be used to get us into the basic sound world, right? So by the end of this class, I'll hope that you'll be able to do 3 things. One is to be able to tell the difference between 2 common chord progressions in rock music, and one of which we've already been working with. Once you have that in your ears, then we'll use that as a chance to kind of get at some of the differences between a pop rock style and a classical jazz one, okay? And then at the end, and this will be especially important for your homework assignment, we'll be identifying ways of making melodies against these chord progressions, right? And on your homework, you'll be asked to do 2 things. One is which will be given a pre-existing pop melody without the lyrics, so you can't just look it up, unless you know the melody, of course. And then you'll be asked to match it to a chord progression that we've learned in class. And then you'll also be asked to write a pop song yourself, or at least 4 bars of one. So that should be fun, right? So before we get back to more cool music, let me introduce a vocab term, which is chord loop. And it should be pretty obvious what it means, right? This is just a chord progression that just loops over and over and over and over and over again. right? So this is already one big difference between the way pop music works and the way most classical and jazz music works. You will often find this chord progression in classical music, but you may hear it once and then you'll expect it to move on to something else. We expect a whole lot of different chord progressions to happen in classical music. Although we'll learn of a case next week where classical music even has some chord loops. But for pop songs, it's like the normal thing to do. You can have one simple 4-chord progression, and it can take you through an entire song, or you might use different chord loops for different parts of the song, right? And the internal structure of the chord loop tends to be really, really simple. It tends to be just basic triads, not a whole lot of 7th chords, at least in the music we'll be looking at. And they're always in root position, pretty much. Pop music does not use a whole lot of inversions. So that's another big difference between this and classical and jazz music. Okay? So with that out of the way, we've been dealing with one chord loop so far, which we've called the 5th progression. And we're going to make a second chord loop that uses the exact same 4 chords, but it's going to rearrange them. Okay? And we're going to call this progression the axis progression. I know what you're thinking. That's a really scary term, right? Like that sounds like a term that you would find in like linear algebra class or something, right? But I promise you, it's much more mundane than that. The reason we call this the axis progression is because of these 3 guys. This is a comedy musical group called the Axis of Awesome, and we named the chord progression after them, right? So yes, this is a real academic music theory term that's named after a comedy group. And these guys, they made, around 2008, they made a mashup song that was pointing out how many songs use this particular progression that they're playing. So we're going to listen to a little bit of that now, so I want you to focus in on the sound of this chord progression, and then we'll put up the chords afterwards, okay?
Do you recognize this? Yeah, that is Don't Stop Believing by Journey. Great song. Very original. There's a few more songs. Check it out. My life is brilliant. My love is pure. I saw an angel. Of that I'm sure. Well, that's just 2 songs that are similar. Forever young. I wanna be forever young. I won't hesitate no more, no more. It cannot wait. I'm yours. This is the way you left me. I'm not pretending. No, happy ending. 'Cause you were amazing. If I could, then I would. I'd go wherever you will go. And she will be loved. Yeah, she will be loved. Pictures of you, pictures of me, hung upon your wall for the world to see. 'Cause I can't believe, with or without you, when I fall at your feet, you let your tears.
Okay, so now hopefully you know what this chord progression sounds like. And here are the chords within it. You can see that they both only use 1 chords, 5 chords, 6 chords, and 4 chords, but they rearrange them slightly, right? And it's pretty incredible how just even simply rearranging something can produce something that has a hugely different effect, or maybe not hugely different, but we'll work on teasing out the sound of these later on in the lecture, right? But for now, let's work a little bit on our axis progression a little more. There are actually 2 flavors of the axis progression. First one is the one that was in all of the songs that you just heard, which is, we'll just call the major version, and it's the one that starts on the 1 chord and just circles all the way around. So because we've heard so many of these, we won't hear a whole bunch of them, but here's one example.
Your lipstick stains on the front of my left side brains. I know I wanted to forget you.
Okay? So that's the one we all know and love. And here is the minor version, which is the same chord loop, you just start 2 chords later. Okay? And we call it the minor version because it starts on a minor chord. Okay? And I recognize that this could actually be interpreted as in a minor key, with that being a minor tonic, but we're just not going to worry about that for right now. Maybe that's something you can deal with in preset. Just for the sake of simplicity, we'll keep all these chords the same for each version. And actually, this is progression has become a lot more common in recent years. Just 2 years ago, the minor version of this chord progression overtook the major version of the chord progression in terms of commonality. So here's a song that was blowing up the charts last year that makes use of this. And actually, this minor version often gets used in songs that are epic or particularly emotional. And one reason why, I think, is that starting on 6, you kind of start in a dark place, and as you go on, you kind of get brighter and brighter. So it's useful for songs that kind of like take you on this journey from darkness into light. So here's one prominent example of this. Other songs that use it to this effect are Beyonce's If I Were a Boy, and also Love the Way You Lie by Eminem and Rihanna uses the same minor chord loop, right? Okay. So notice how there's only one, speaking of minor chords, there's only one minor chord in the whole thing, right? In all the progressions we've learned, there's only one minor chord. So if you're having trouble distinguishing these, a good strategy is to listen for where the minor chord happens, right? So up on screen, I've placed all 3 progressions there for you so you can see where the minor chord happens in them. So at least for us, and I don't know how Professor Joe is going to test this, but we won't ask you to identify other kinds of chord loops in. So if you're asked to pick out which chord loop it is, then if you hear it start with minor chord, it's the minor axis progression. If the minor chord is the second one, it's the 50s progression. And if it's the third one, it's the major version of the axis progression. Of course, these aren't the only chord loops that exist, but for our purposes, they are. Okay? All right. So most of the songs, we've been pretty much going with one chord loop per song. Okay? But you can also make it to where you use different chord loops for different parts of a song. In Ed Sheeran's Perfect, for instance, the verse and the bridge, which is most of the song, probably about 75% of the song, he uses the 50s progression. But then he goes to the minor axis progression in the chorus. So let's hear this.
Darling, just kiss me slow. Your heart is so lion, and in your eyes you're holding mine. Baby, I'm dancing in the dark with you between my arms, barefoot on the grass.
All right, so those are 2 or 2.5 basic chord progressions that we'll work with for pretty much the rest of the lecture, okay? That's all the chord progressions you're going to get today. Actually, we'll get one more in one song. But first of all, we're going to now turn to issues of voice leading. And I guess the big question here is how much do these issues of voice leading and counterpoint that we've learned in regards to classical music, how much does it actually matter in rock music, right? And I will answer that for you today. It sort of does, right? So it's definitely not as important as in classical music or jazz. And I'll let you maybe ask your preceptor maybe why people don't care about parallel fifths and parallel octaves in rock music. This is something that there's no right answer for. I think we all have our own individual ideas. But it's an interesting question. Why do they just not care about this? And why did the other style care so much about it? Anyways. But it does matter in some ways. And part of it has to do with what instrument you're playing on. So who here has played an acoustic guitar before? Right? So if you play guitar, often what you're doing is playing these kind of basic chord shapes or positions of the left hand on the fretboard, right? And so like if you see an A chord, you just play it the same way. If you see a C chord, you play it one way. So there's not a whole lot of thought involved in how I connect one chord to the next. You just sort of are putting your hand wherever you know where that chord is, right? On the piano, on the other hand, it's a much different story. It actually ends up being the case that if you're writing good piano parts, you're pretty much writing good voice leading, and vice versa. Okay? So if we inhabit the mindset of like a rock pianist, then we'll still be doing stuff that sounds a lot like smooth voice leading for us. And so to get at this, we're going to take our 50s progression and we're going to transform it into something that a pianist would actually like to play. So here is if you were to just play them all root position, right, then our pianist has to move their hand for every single chord, right? And they don't like to do that, okay? So instead what they're going to do is they're going to try to put this into a form where they can move each finger as little as they have to, right? So the first thing they're going to do is they're going to look for what tones can I just play that are common between these chords, right? So what notes are held in common between a C chord and an A chord? Who can answer that? C and an E, right? So you just hold those two together. Sorry, I had an extra animation there. Okay? And then, so you've only got one note in the chord left. And then you just move that G to the closest A that you can. And that creates this. And that's it. That's pretty much all voice leading right there. Okay? You've unlocked the secrets. And hopefully, even when you get back to classical music, you can take that with you. That's all it is. Okay? So then we're going to do the same thing for the next progression. Now this is trickier because you may have to shift some things up an octave to see the common tones. But there are also two common tones between these two chords. What are they? C, you can see right there, and the F. Yeah? So we hold those, and again we have one note to move, so we just yeet that on up to F. Okay? Now, between the final two chords, we have a problem. Because how many common tones do we have? We don't have any at all, right? Okay. So this is a situation where our pianist is going to have to move every note, right? So you pretty much have two options, right? If you're here, you can either go up, move everybody up, or you can move everybody down, right? So one option is to move everybody up, right? You just move everybody up to the closest member of the 5-chord you can. And if you were to write this for us in a classical music counterpoint class, you would get mondo points off for this. Why? Because there are parallel octaves and parallel fifths, right? So you have the F, the G, and the C, and D. So this is something that a classical player would never do, but a pop player they don't have a problem with this pretty much at all, right? So on the other hand, if you chose the option that moved down, I won't go into why, but it happens to be the case that you'll just automatically avoid all of your problems. Right? So this is a voicing that both classical pianists and jazz pianists can use. Pretty much, they can do it the same way. And it has the added advantage of creating, when you loop the progression around, you've already got this, your highest note is held in common between the two chords, right? So the basic takeaway here is that it's actually really hard to write bad voice leading on the piano. Good voice leading is a really intuitive thing to do on a piano. So if you just think like a pianist, then you can sort of automatically get a lot of the voice leading tricks down automatically, even without having to think about the particular rules that we're working with, okay? So all you have to do is try to do as little as possible, but in this style, right, in pop and rock music, you don't have to worry so much about parallel perfect intervals. They just happen all the time, and nobody really cares about them. Okay? So move as little as possible should be your takeaway not only from here, but pretty much for the whole class when it comes to voice leading, all right? All right. How am I looking? Okay. So we're going to now, I'm going to quickly walk us through harmonizing the axis progression in the same mindset. Right, so again, moving from the first chord to the second, we look first for any chord tones that we can keep in common, which happens to be the G, and then we move the rest of our notes down to the closest that we can, like that. Moving from 5 to 6 again, we don't have any common tones. You can check that out with these little guide tones that I provided for you at the bottom. Right? So we compromised with the classical pianist last time, so let's be punk rock and say screw the rules and just, you know, do a full up motion like this. It's totally fine, pop music. And then we've already voice led 6 to 4 in the last progression, so we can do the same thing. Hold 2 notes in common and keep that guy on up there. All right. And so that creates a chord progression that sounds like this. Right? Super simple to play on the piano. Okay? So that's all that voice leading is. Congratulations, you've unlocked the secret. Okay. So now let's turn back to some real music. Enough of me playing on piano. And see how melodies work. Okay? And so one thing I've often talked about in my precept is that the way melodies often work is they often have a kind of main note that happens on the downbeat, right? So oftentimes you can figure out what a melody is doing by kind of holding on to the note you hear on the downbeat until you get to the next downbeat, right? So as we listen to this song, it's going to play. This melody is going to play through twice. So what I want you to do is first just listen to the song. And then next time, try to hum to yourself the first note you hear on each downbeat, and see if you can connect them together. Okay? Here we go.
So I won't hesitate no more, no more. It cannot wait. I'm sure there's no need to complicate. Our time is short. This is our fate. I'm yours.
So as I tried to highlight there, these are kind of the main notes throughout, right? And then you kind of do some other stuff in between, but there's this really smooth connection from one measure to the next, right? So this is actually one really common way of making melodies against chord progressions, is that you take this kind of smooth voice leading thing that we just did a second ago, and I didn't feel like playing this in B major, so I'm going to play this in C. And then you just kind of trace out a little path within that, like that for this song. Right? So Jason's melody kind of moves. Right? So this is this kind of secret way in which voice leading still matters. Right? Because good voice leading will tend to produce good materials for you to make melodies with. Right? And this is also going to be the first and most basic paradigm for creating voices we have, which we'll call a chord tone harmonization. Right? It's basically just, or chord tone melody, I should say. Right? Which just means your melody follows the chord tones of the chord. Right? All right. This also provides a way for us to think about the differences between the two different chord progressions that we've learned, because the different chord progressions have different kinds of voices that move, right? So the axis progression, as we can just see here, really lets you do things that at least start out by moving stepwise from measure to measure, right? And here's another song that does the same thing. It still moves measure to measure down by step, but it starts on this note rather than the top note, so on C rather than E. Let's hear this.
So I'm gonna love you, like I'm gonna lose you. I'm gonna hold you, like I'm saying goodbye. Wherever we're standing, I won't take you for granted. 'Cause we'll never know it when you run out of time. So I'm gonna love you.
So this is another way to help you distinguish the progressions, because if you hear these kinds of stepwise descents or ascents from measure to measure, it's dead giveaway that it's an axis progression. Yeah? You can also move in the other direction. So both of these melodies move down by step, but if you can see, if you start on the same note, you can move up from C to D to E to F, right? For some reason, and I have no clue why, this is not all that common in pop music. But when it happens, it's really, really, really cool. So here's one of my favorite examples of it. And it sounds so super triumphant when it happens, right? Like each time we step up, things get a little more intense, a little more heroic sounding. It's perfect for the kind of mood and attitude she's trying to convey here, right?
This is my fight song. Take back my life song. Prove I'm right song. My power's turned up. Show you right now I'll be strong.
Right, so that's the axis progression, lets you have a lot of really cool stepwise melodies. The 50s progression lets you do something a little different, right? Now remember, the thing about the 50s progression is how many common tones are held between these two chords, right? So what that means is that what this is really useful for is if you have like a cool melodic idea that you want to get out over the first chord, you can keep it around a lot of times for the second chord and just not move at all, right? So that's the kind of thing that you often hear happening in 50s progression. Something is stated over the one chord, and then they sing the exact same thing again over the sixth chord. And here's a classic example from classic country music. And let's hear this.
The lights and the harbor shine for me. I'm like a lost ship adrift on the sea. The sea of a heart.
Right, so another chord, song that we've already heard does the same thing. Where's this? There we go. So if you remember how this bridge starts out, it goes like, darling, just kiss me slow. And then he repeats the exact same thing again. Your heart is all I know. Right, that's the same exact melody, repeated as he changes from a one chord to the sixth chord, right? And so it gives this kind of effect of like the same thing, but it kind of gets a new kind of color to it, right? Let's hear.
Darling, just kiss me slow. Your heart is all I own, and in your eyes, you're holding mine.
So as you work on your homework assignments, it can be helpful to make these kinds of voice leading graphs for yourself. We won't ask you to voice lead these progressions in your homework, but it can be a good starting point for you as you're making melodies for yourself, right? Okay. So for the last part of class, we're going to talk about a very different way of approaching making melodies. But we're going to start with something that actually seems to be doing something very similar. This is Lady Gaga's Million Reasons. And initially, it actually seems to be doing literally, this is a 50s progression down here. And it literally seems to be doing exactly the same thing we heard in Ed Sheeran's song, and in Don Gibson's, which is she has a note there, she can hold it in common between those two chords, so she does, and she keeps going. But something weird happens in the last measure. So try to tell me what it is, and there will be an animation, a big red dot that will appear marking what's the weird thing. But yeah, so let's listen to this.
You're giving me a million reasons to let you go. You're giving me a million reasons to quit the show. You're giving me a million reasons. Give me a million reasons. Giving me a million reasons. About a million reasons. If I had a highway, I would run for the hills. If you could find a dry way, I'd forever be still. But you're giving me a million reasons. Give me a million reasons. Giving me a million reasons. About a million.
So what's the weird, why is that note in red? It's not in chord, right? There's no C in a G chord, right? So here's actually what she's playing. I've included her little harmonizations over top of it there. As you can see, like she starts off going, and then she keeps that around over top of this G chord in the rest of the band, right? So that's the weird thing about this, right? Is that what Gaga is essentially doing is she's holding onto this C, no matter what else is happening, right? So she's no longer fitting her melodies to what the chords are doing. You can see how it's very different from when you're trying to like play around with the guitar and you've got a chord progression going and you're saying, okay, what melody sounds good against this? It's going to be something that sounds consonant with it, right? Here, she's kind of looking for a moment where there's like a weird, cool sound that's dissonant, right? So that's the cool other way of relating harmonies and melodies together. And we will have a special term for this, which we will call the melodic harmonic divorce. Okay? And essentially it just means that like what the melody is doing is completely independent from what the harmony is doing. The harmony is doing a simple 50s progression, but the melody is, rather than fitting into chord tones of that, it's just saying, I'm going to hold on to this note through whatever. Okay? We actually learned a term last week for something in classical music where this same kind of thing happens, but it tends to happen in the bass voice. Does anybody remember what we called it? A pedal point. Yeah, exactly. And that tends to be how it happens in classical music, but this is an example of it happening in a melodic line, which is pretty unique to pop music. I mean, I won't say it never happens in classical music, but it's pretty bonkers when it does. Whereas this is totally, totally normal in pop music. So the idea is that you're going to hold on to this, to pretty much notes that come from a tonic chord, right? And then you're just going to let the rest of the chords just kind of make these weird clashes with it, no matter how weird those can be, right? And Gaga does it by holding on to the tonic note. Here's another kind of classic example from Coldplay that does the same thing. You can kind of see here that the melody is pretty much only it's just holding on to members of an F major chord, right? It doesn't change harmonies at all. Meanwhile, the band is not playing an F major chord until bar 3, right? So that creates these really cool harmonies in this song. So let's just hear this.
Come up to meet you, tell you I'm sorry. You don't know how lovely you are. I had to find you, tell you I need you, tell you I set you apart.
So, like, if we were to just play the two, like the melody and the harmony on top of each other, it would sound something like this. Right? Super cool, right? But the idea here is that the reason why they tend to hold on to members of a tonic chord and not, do whatever, is that it makes, if you're making a whole lot of dissonances with your chords, then that can be pretty hard to sing. But if you're just using, everybody can arpeggiate a tonic chord, right? So it kind of balances out. It makes it easy to sing even though you're creating lots of crazy dissonances, right? So that tends to be why when you will write a melodic harmonic divorce or when you will analyze one, you'll tend to be looking for stuff that's just hanging out on tonic chord stuff, okay? That's kind of one of its defining characteristics. All right, any questions about the melodic harmonic divorce? It's a new concept, so if anything's not super clear about it, then now's your chance. I'm sure the preceptors will be glad to answer questions as well. Seeing none, we're going to take a look at two more examples. I might actually let you guys off early. This one, we finally can use this melodic harmonic divorce idea to get away from our two progressions that we've learned today. Okay? So we're introducing a new progression, y'all. But it's in some ways an even more boring progression because it's just 4 to 5. The whole time in this song, the band is just playing. Ad nauseam. That's all they play, right? But what do you notice about what the singer is singing? What's the singer? Where are his melodic notes coming from? A D major chord, right? Which the band never plays, right? And so this is a really cool situation where, the band never plays a tonic chord at all in the whole song, right? And the tonic chord is only played by the voice, right? So this is such a cool song, you guys. I don't know if you've ever heard of Jane's Addiction or this particular song, but man, this stuff is real cool. Let me play it for you. So again, if you were to play these two chords on top of each other, it would just, the whole song basically sounds like this, which is so cool. This is awesome stuff, you guys. Okay, so we have, I only have one more example for y'all, and then I might let you all off about 5 minutes early. This comes from a song near and dear to my heart, from my childhood, Blink-182, Feeling This. And this is a really cool case where they actually use kind of both ways of doing melodies and harmonies together. So if you notice, you start off doing something that sounds very much like a chord tone melody, right? You start on E, but there's no E in the 5 chord, so he moves up to F, right, or F sharp, I should say. And then there's no F sharp in a C sharp chord, so he moves down to E. So this sounds like a pretty normal chord tone melody, right? But this comes from the end of the song, and you start layering up other harmony voices on top of it. And as you add more and more stuff, things start to sound a little bit more like they're just hanging out on tonic chords the whole time, right? So this is actually a case where the melody tends to be pretty straight up chord tone melody, but the harmonic voices over top of it tend to be the melodic harmonic chords. Let's hear this. This is another just crazy great song. I love this song. Isn't that cool? Yeah. This song got me through many a breakup in middle school. Yeah. So it feels really weird to come back and analyze it. But yeah, so like just to kind of end our lesson, let's look a little closer about what's actually going on. So if you look at the way the lead voice here harmonizes with the first harmony voice, at least in these first 2 chords, they almost make perfect 2-voice counterpoint, right? They have 1/4 in there, so they would have gotten 1 point off, but like overall, like that sounds like something that you would write in like a counterpoint exercise, right? Which is really kind of cool. And then you have weird stuff coming afterwards, which is like. So it's already in the second part of this progression that things start to kind of uncouple a little bit. But it gets worse as things go, right? Up here, well, I might as well finish the next slide. So here are all the notes in the chord, or in the texture, that just aren't with the chord at all. And as you can see, they tend to happen more and more as you get through the progression, and as you add more and more voices on top of it, right? So this is a really cool situation where as you start to listen to it, it's a very chord tone harmonization style thing. And then as you get to the end, it's more melodic harmonic divorce style thing. So with this in mind, I wasn't going to do this, but we have time. Let's go back and just listen to this. about this cool like effect that they get at the end where it's just they fade out the band. And that was totally an accident, apparently, if the legend is true. They were just listening back, and the the producer meant to do just a classic fade out at the end of the song, but he just forgot to turn. He just like ended up accidentally turning down the band rather than the whole volume levels, right? And the band was like, "Wow, that's so cool. Let's just keep that effect in," right? So oftentimes rock music comes about through these kinds of moments of accidental genius, right? Where you weren't really trying to create this cool kind of almost Beach Boys like harmonic effect at the end, but you end up doing it, and it's just super cool, right? So you've already seen this. So yeah, so that's most of what I have today. So just to recap, the main takeaways here are the idea of chord loop and the 2.5 chord loops we've learned, the 50s progression, which is 1, 6, 4, 5, and the various axis progressions, 1, 5, 6, 4. And I'll put this PowerPoint slide up on Blackboard, assuming I have the permissions to do so you all can go back and listen to these and see the Wikipedia articles that have even more songs you can listen to, okay? And melody-wise, remember that from downbeat to downbeat, melodies often go from one chord tone to another, much like classical music, but you have this extra resource available to you where you can just hold on to members of a tonic chord and let it make cool dissonances against the chord loop. Okay? That's all I have, but I would be sort of remiss if I gave a talk on rock music in the great state of New Jersey without once mentioning Bruce Springsteen. So you all can leave, but I'll let Bruce play us out, all right? So thank you and have a great weekend.